Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 64. The year is 2021, and in just a few short weeks, we will be upon the 58th anniversary of the JFK assassination. And just about the one-year anniversary date of this podcast. 63 episodes produced before today. Well, actually, 64 when you count the prologue. I forgot to number that one. I was not really sure at the time that there would ever be more than one, let alone 63 more. Well, today's episode is episode number 64, and I guess it's really the 65th. Anyway, last week's episode was an important number. It's obviously symbolic at episode number 63, the same number as the year of the assassination, and it's an episode production pace that is just a little more than one a week. So hopefully it's been satisfactory in terms of satisfying your own interest in the topic and fitting in with the time available in your own life to do so. I know that lately you have had to wait a little longer in between episodes, but the material is, frankly, getting murkier. You know, I've said this on several occasions that I am an N of one. I am but one person producing everything about this podcast. Well, that's only possible because I am not doing any original research. Sure, I am synthesizing all sorts of material from all sorts of sources and applying what I hope to be a cogent, analytical approach and even my own writing and delivery style at the end of the day. But we have to give credit where credit is due. So much of the autopsy story comes from some of the original researchers in this area. I have to pay a tribute to David Lifton. David is quite controversial in some ways. He wrote a bestseller back in the 1960s called Best Evidence. At that time, he forged a relationship with Wesley Liebler after the publication of the Warren Commission, and while he was a student in college at UCLA, and Liebler was there as a professor. If you've been listening to the podcast or you are more than knee-deep inside of the JFK assassination story, you know that Wesley Liebler was an important figure on the Warren Commission staff. Liebler was a lawyer that was responsible for much of the generalist work, so to speak, that was done regarding who Lee Harvey Oswald really was and why he might have done it. You've heard Liebler at times on this podcast taking witness depositions, some of which were humorously controlled by the overriding culture that dominated how the staff was to approach things at the Warren Commission. Some of it was just Liebler, too. After the Warren Commission report was published and after it began to be criticized and after the world was just learning how to push back on the Warren Commission report, well, Liebler, he too was actually pushing a little bit from the inside out. His world was beginning to open up and in some ways contribute to that movement. He was a critic in some ways, and don't get me wrong, in other ways he was an ardent defender. Nevertheless, his desire and decision to receive the invitation of connection from Lifton in the post-Warren Commission publication period was indeed a catalyst for David Lifton himself. Lifton's own matriculation on the JFK matter may have been a product of the spectacular and the unbelievable, all combined. What I mean by that is that there was such a wide gap in the difference between how the Parkland doctors, who were frankly more experienced in reviewing gunshot wounds, well, in reconciling what they looked at and what they saw while they were treating the president. And what came out of the autopsy itself from the Bethesda doctors, who were quite less experienced than the Parkland doctors. Well, at least at looking at gunshot wounds anyway. Well, it was such a wide chasm that there needed to be a deeper study and a deeper understanding of how things could be seen so differently between two sets of clinical professionals. Look, It's not necessarily unusual that a doctor who is tasked with saving the life of a patient sees certain things differently than a pathologist who is trained in forensics. To study a death in the silence of a morgue and to observe and inspect and do surgery on a dead body, literally, they really are two different specialties. One of my doctor friends said, "Yes, when you put it that way, I totally agree." Forensic pathology does not intersect really in any way with the work of a doctor who takes care of the living. Everything is relative in life. Much of the evidence that was gathered for Lifton's book was done several years post the actual assassination. And back then, they wondered if that passage of time, that amount of time, would be too much to overcome when it came to ensuring a proper reconciliation of memory by the critical witnesses that were involved. Isn't that a rather humorous discussion today when we are now 58 years past the assassination and most of the witnesses to anything relevant are dead? And if they were alive, well, at this age, who knows? Thankfully, individuals undertook that task at the moment of consciousness about how controversial the Warren Commission report really was. It might have been 4 years past the fact, and that might have seemed like a long time at that moment in the analysis of a crime scene, but it wasn't. It wasn't 40 years past the fact, or today it wasn't 58 years past the fact. What do they say? A journey of 1,000 miles begins with the initial first step. These folks took just that, and just then. Thank goodness they did. Lifton and his bestseller, Best Evidence, he did a wonderful job in many ways of documenting an incredible amount of important historical activity. Where I depart with his findings are his fundamental premise that the body was altered somewhere between Parkland and the moment of the official autopsy. This was his way of reconciliation between what the good doctors at Parkland saw and what the good doctors at Bethesda saw. It was a way to justify what both doctor groups saw and leave both doctor groups somewhat pristine in the discussion, as if no forces had been bearing down on them, and they themselves had done nothing dubious. By inserting the concept of some unforeseen nefarious force in between the two, a force that did something to alter the president's body. Something to make a difference between the physical evidence that those doctors saw at Parkland in the form of JFK's body and the same physical evidence that doctors then subsequently viewed and analyzed at Bethesda after the body was delivered there. Honestly, the attempts to reconcile this are born out of the fact that the facts, as seen by both groups of doctors, are, at certain moments, so widely divergent. It's hard to believe that they all saw the same body. Had this not occurred, I don't think David Lifton would have gone to the extremes of thinking in the way that he did. That is just me talking here. But because these discrepancies were in fact the case, and because there was a necessity to reconcile these gaping differences, these theories sprung into life and sprung into action. Sadly, I believe they negate so much original and objective historical research that is relevant to telling the story of the JFK autopsy. Maybe Lifton is right that the body was altered in some way. There are some things that perhaps point to that, but honestly, I doubt it. There are other problems with the autopsy and the documentation surrounding the autopsy and the conclusions contained in the autopsy. But I don't believe they involve surgery prior to the autopsy itself. Now, before any of you conclude on any of this, we'll get to some interesting topics on that very subject. There were two particular FBI agents present at the autopsy, and ironically, these two FBI agents may have been the only two telling the more comprehensive truth that night. The truth about what really happened, and they documented it in a 302 report that, can you believe it, never made its way into the Warren Commission documents. So surprising. But that report was later subsequently unearthed. Siebert and O'Neill are their names. I'm a stickler for precision language. Be very careful about the words you use, the way you say something, how you choose to deliver it. I am not always personally perfect at that, but I do realize that an imperfection in the delivery of anything you say, particularly on a technical subject, can be a real disaster. These two men and their now famous FBI report of the autopsy basically stated that there had been surgery to the head. Well, if you are a conspiracy theorist, this is like serving up an underhand pitch when you're trying to hit one out of left field and far beyond the bleachers. Surgery to the head prior to the actual official autopsy starting? Yes, sir. That's what the literal reading of that document says. Thankfully, there is an explanation for that. We're going to get into the Siebert and O'Neill report, but not yet. Hold on for just a minute. These guys were heroes of sorts. I'll explain that when we get into it. The original tangent of this prologue was to pay due respect to David Lifton and to others too, like William Manchester and folks like James Fetzer and Cyril Wecht, and to Dr. Livingston and Mantic, or lesser-known authors such as Mike Davis, who have a sharp analytical mind to the basic facts, and the kind of person who has built on some of the basic work that was done by someone like Sylvia Maurer. And really, there was a whole host of others, all of whom have either in a very comprehensive way or tangentially added something rich to the discussion about the autopsy. Lifton, in Best Evidence, dedicates a whole section of the book on the decoy ambulance. It was, under certain circumstances, a standard technique to use two ambulances, one of which carried the real body in one ambulance and another that carried nothing. It was just a decoy. Why you need a decoy ambulance in the first place for a dead body is an interesting side topic that we won't get into here. But yes, there are perhaps protocols for such things. The motorcade that night from Andrews Air Force Base to Bethesda did indeed contain a decoy ambulance. Lifton figured that out. There was a significant delay in the delivery of the body to Bethesda and the start of the autopsy. Combine this with a substantial level of confusion around a second ambulance, this decoy ambulance, and then add to it conflicting reports about what time the body arrived at the morgue and whether or not it arrived in a common shipping casket, and then the time the actual autopsy got started, a gap of time for sure, perhaps up to about 90 minutes from about 6:35 p.m. to just about 8, a time gap that created opportunity for nefarious behavior in the eyes of Lifton. And the next thing you know, all these factors combined, a time lag, a decoy ambulance, a shipping casket, well, it all becomes fertile ground for concluding that there was a surgical alteration of JFK's body before the official autopsy actually occurred. A break in the chain of evidence combined with a real evil dose of something. A pretty big leap of faith, I think, in all things nefarious. But then again, you add on top of it the testimony of a handful of minor participants in the handling of the president's body, where some pretty interesting things get said, well, all of which point to those very nefarious things. This altogether introduces some wonder about the topic, if not out and out reasonable doubt. Now, we are not in a courtroom, but if we were, and you are the jury here, well, there may be reasonable doubt regarding a pristine chain of custody. And if that is true, you got a hell of a formula for something very sinister when you listen to some of those testimonials. Look, I can't buy the Lifton theory that the body was altered, but that doesn't negate the rather prodigious level of research that was done on so many other topics by Lifton and done in the time frame that was so much closer to real time than we could ever hope to get to now. Let's listen carefully to all the true facts that we know about in this part of the JFK story from many official and other sources, including researchers and some eyewitnesses. Rarely this was under sworn testimony, but at least a bit of critical testimony was. Let's keep the baby and throw out the bathwater. You've heard that one before from me. So, to say it more plainly, let's make our own decisions on what is real and what is conjecture, and what is simply made up in order to sell books and make others famous in the midst of someone else's tragedy. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 64 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Finally, the ambulance would make its way from the main entrance of the hospital to the area around the back where the entrance to the morgue was located. There was still one hurdle to get the JFK body and the casket inside the morgue. In today's terms, we tend to think of egress and exit, especially at a healthcare facility, that is more easily navigated by ramps. Ramps that are nowadays required by the ADA or the Americans with Disabilities Act. Not back then. There was a typical concrete infrastructure in front of the morgue that was unusually hard to navigate, and once you got past that, you still had to go up a short flight of concrete steps that were guarded by a handrail. It was a narrow traverse, especially when trying to navigate it with an 800-pound casket in tow. Awkward is the best adjective to describe the group of men involved as they took the president's casket up a turn and next to that steel handrail. Godfrey McHugh was with them, and they included men who had flown back from the Andrews Air Force Base on the H-21 helicopter, the honor guard under Sam Byrd. They were all helping now and trying to get the president's casket in position within the morgue. Godfrey McHugh would say it would be appropriate for a general to join hands with the 5 enlisted men, and he then relieved the Coast Guardsmen on the team. He soon found himself, as prideful as that moment might have been in the sorrow of the exercise, simply incapable of helping the rest of the team lug the large casket up the steps. He soon yielded back to the Coast Guardsmen. Now, as your official podcaster, I'm going to stop there. Right from the very beginning of bringing the president's body into the morgue, there are varying accounts of how the casket even got inside and who took the president's body out of the casket. Some of the controversy starts right here. Remember that I mentioned Siebert and O'Neill, the 2 FBI agents. Well, Jim Siebert remembers no such honor guard group assisting in the traverse up the steps to the morgue. He clearly remembers that he and O'Neill, that is the 2 FBI agents, and then Roy Kellerman and William Greer, the 2 Secret Service agents, then supplemented by a few of the Bethesda staff that were on hand. That is who brought up the casket. But O'Neill at one point stuck to the story that the honor guard was involved. There is some validity to the theory that O'Neill may have been aware of the gross deviation from the government's protocol of having the honor guard perform this task. But if they were not involved, then it brings up more serious concerns about the comments made by O'Neill. Unfortunately, these stories and the confusion about a basic fact of who took JFK's casket out of the limousine have added another dimension to the mystery that David Lifton and others have espoused about a second casket, a cheap shipping casket that may have also been delivered by one of the parties, as they tell the story of the decoy ambulance and the delivery of a second casket. This confusion fits right into Lifton's theory. But for the moment, we won't get distracted with that. Promise you, though, I will come back to it. Suffice it to say that the honking bronze casket containing the president finally made its way into the anteroom of the morgue, and then finally into the main autopsy room of the morgue. And then it was finally opened up. And there he was. There are a few different time references, but suffice it to say that by about 7:35 p.m. that evening, the president's body was well positioned in the morgue to start the process of the autopsy. At about 7:35 p.m., the process of removing him from the casket had begun, and they started by unwrapping the president. He was enclosed in sheets, several of them, and one was separately wrapped around his head. And in the few hours between Parkland and Bethesda, his head had continued to bleed. The separate sheet that covered his head was covered in blood. Autopsies are messy, as you may well suspect. It is truly a surgical procedure performed on the body. So before all of that commences, there was a set of radiology x-rays that were taken and a set of photographs that were taken. In a minute, we will meet the men involved in that process. It took the better part of a half hour to complete this work, and the actual autopsy itself started somewhere between 8 o'clock and 8:15 that night. Again, before we get into those details, it's probably prudent to introduce all of the characters in this chapter of the play. So let's take the time now to introduce everyone that was documented to be in the room that evening at Bethesda as part of the autopsy team, or simply as a witness. There is much folklore and, quite frankly, a central question around who was there that night and whether the autopsy itself was tightly controlled by the military or the CIA or the FBI or the Secret Service. All of these agencies had personnel present with the exception of the CIA, and all of them represented powerful government forces. And if you go back to my central question around whether the autopsy was legitimate or not, and if you take that to its highest level of speculation, there is then a fundamental question of whether the autopsy was broadly controlled by one or more of those groups. So let's meet the players. Here is the good news. The Siebert and O'Neill FBI report filed on the autopsy is widely believed to be the only comprehensive inventory of individuals who attended the autopsy that night. Do you remember the scene in Oliver Stone's JFK where the good doctors are attempting to perform an appropriate and thorough forensic examination and autopsy, and there is a rather misty fog-like moment within the autopsy room, and the room itself is overflowing with what appears to be military personnel and men in black suits, the power structure of the government bearing down on them. Well, honestly, as much as I really like that movie, and there is a lot of truth contained in that movie, that scene is one where there was some editorial discretion applied. So let's summarize who was there, and you can decide if it was nefarious or not, at least per se, based on attendance. The Siebert and O'Neill report contains the names of 24 individuals that were there that night. That count does not include 4 individuals from the Gawler Funeral Home who subsequently entered the morgue after the autopsy was completed. They did so to perform the work on the president in order to ready his body so that it could then be taken to the White House. Let's start with the main characters, and I will list first those that were there primarily to perform something related to the autopsy itself, and then finish with those that appeared to be there for just observation and as witnesses. The 3 main characters are the doctors that were there to perform or in some way participate in the autopsy. That was Commander James J. Humes, the central character in the autopsy, and the Dr. J. Thornton Boswell. Also present was Dr. Pierre Fink. Fink joined the autopsy in process after being called by Commander Humes. Fink did not glove up, but instead observed the autopsy as it was being conducted. We'll get into the background of these 3 individuals in the next episode. John Ebersol was chief of radiology. He was the primary person charged with conducting the radiological exam. Ebersol may be the most compelling and impressive witness in this clinical group. I am teasing you a little bit now, and I do promise that I will reveal the reason for that soon enough. Mr. John Stringer was the medical photographer. J.C. Jenkins and Paul O'Connor were in the pathology department and were there to give assistance in whatever ways doctors directed, including the performance of some minor autopsy procedures themselves. We'll hear some astounding information from both of them before these episodes on the autopsy are over. Gerald Kresser and Edward Reed were supporting staff from the X-ray department and assisted John Ebersol in his function as the chief radiologist. There appears to be 2 other medical personnel that were essentially assistants and were in the detail listing contained in the Siebert and O'Neill report, but the report does not specify what they did. Finding that out proved to be more difficult, and a cursory review and other documents produced nothing for me. So without digging further, I am going to assume that they may have played a minor clinical support role. It may be because their names were misspelled in the Siebert and O'Neill reports. For instance, one individual spelled Lloyd Ray may actually be Floyd Rabe, a name that was more clearly spelled on a receipt that was made that night for photography and radiographic materials. The other individual was James Metzler. That makes for a running total so far of 11 medical personnel. So, who are the other 13 individuals in the room, and why were they there? First, let's start with the Secret Service. There were 3 Secret Service agents there that night. You already know 2 of them. Men that had a real interest in this and a real connection to the Kennedys. William Greer, the driver of the limousine, and Roy Kellerman. And there was a 3rd Secret Service agent there too, Agent William O'Leary. There were 2 FBI agents, Siebert and O'Neill, as you know, and the Bureau asked for 2 to make sure that there was a clear chain of custody of the body as it arrived from Andrews, and that what was seen and what was documented that night at the autopsy was objectively reported on and could be corroborated by another agent. So that is 5 of the remaining 13 accounted for so far. 8 to go. Next, let's turn to the naval officers. The Bethesda campus is run by naval officers, so no surprise, right? Men with high ranks who wear officers' clothes and naval caps and the kind of uniforms that conjure up all sorts of power persona. And there were plenty of those that day, and for the most part, it seemed pretty logical for them to be there. Now, we have 8 to go to get to 24, so let's talk about 4 naval officer observers. First, Captain Jack Stover, who was head of the U.S. Naval Medical School at Bethesda. Second, Admiral Galloway, who was head of the entire campus at Bethesda, and to which Captain Stover reported. Galloway had overall authority over all of these medical functions at Bethesda, including the medical school and the hospital, all reporting up to him. And then there was Captain David Osborne, who was chief of surgery at Bethesda Hospital. Lieutenant Commander Greg Cross, whose position was not described in the report, also entered with Dr. Osborne. Okay, we're now down to the remaining 4. First, Godfrey McHugh, the Air Force military aide to the president, who we know well already in this story. He was a trusted friend of the Kennedys. Also present was another doctor, Dr. George Bakeman of the U.S. Navy. It's not clear why he was there, but he was a doctor. Late in the game came Chester Boyers of the U.S. Navy, who was an individual called in to type up some of the receipts for the materials that were handed over to the Secret Service and the FBI. And finally, Admiral Berkeley himself, the president's personal physician. We know him well already on this podcast. That's it. That's the group that was there. There were many, for sure, and a lot of them were uniformed officers, probably all looking pretty powerful in their military outfits. But when you break it down, not so nefarious a group, really. And for me, being in the hospital business, this group seemed like a natural to be there. Now, we don't know what went on there. I don't want to speculate on that. Could there have been force applied behind the scenes? Possibly, but it was not applied by some odd forces that were called in off the bench by the CIA or someone in some overt fashion, such as you might expect in a political coup. If it happened, it was more subtle than that. But I am neither black or white here, nor am I naive. It could have happened. And in fact, there is at least one credible witness that would say, maybe it did. We will hear from him shortly. This was a significant wander to chronicle all 24 individuals in the autopsy room, but I did that for a purpose. First, I wanted to introduce you to the players, and there are so many. so that hearing their names, at least in the beginning, may make it easier to follow the story. But more importantly, to diffuse one of the most important questions around the autopsy itself. Who was there in the room that night, in attendance at the autopsy, and why were they there? And what influences might they have had on the conduct of the autopsy itself? There's a lot of mystery around this topic, and really without anyone ever diving much into these details. This may be the only time you will ever hear it on a podcast, but at least you'll understand that while there were a lot of people in that room that night, it wasn't set up to execute a conspiracy by using overt force or influence in the room on the physicians. Given the circumstances, it was a group you would likely expect to be there. Thank you for listening to episode 64 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK. The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 65. Didn't I tell you that the autopsy was a medical labyrinth? We're hardly into it, and it may have already started to feel that way to you. Or maybe I just know too much already. But I do know I'm in the labyrinth. So before we do any more crawling around in the weeds, I want to pause for a moment and talk a little bit about the central questions and issues that surround the autopsy. There are a lot of them. I've been talking around the edges of that for the last 2 episodes, giving generalities mostly, and only a couple of specifics. More storytelling so far. But I think it would be good if we spend this episode discussing the inventory of the more controversial aspects of the autopsy and its implications. Then, in subsequent episodes, we can tell the rest of the story on what happened that night and in the ensuing periods after, too. And we'll view the rest of the autopsy proceedings through the eyes of Siebert and O'Neill and others. Don't worry, this is like a lake with lots of fingers that reach out everywhere. And in search of the truth, we'll go down a number of those fingers, always mindful of how to get back to the main water of the lake and make it home. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 65 of JFK. The Enduring Secret. So why is it that the autopsy itself is so controversial? There exists a 7 or so page official autopsy report, the official report. It has but just a few words on the face page. Cause of death? Gunshot wound to the head. Pretty simple and straightforward, isn't it? There is absolutely no controversy about it. JFK died of a gunshot wound to the head. And the rest is the sad story of the assassination, and the rest of the details are, in a human sense, somewhat irrelevant. But killing anyone, let alone killing the President of the United States, is a crime in our country. This murder is now one of the most famous in the history of the modern world. Movements occurring in the moment sometimes take over great events. But if cooler heads would have prevailed on the day of the assassination, they would have immediately begun thinking like an investigator, and knowing that the nature of the crime would likely never be fully resolved without an impregnable autopsy result. That you should not lead evidence to a result, but rather that evidence itself should lead you, as an investigator, to the truth And yet, from the very beginning, this whole thing, this thing of the autopsy, was a C-minus attempt to check the box on something. An autopsy that the Kennedy family was not terribly interested in for various reasons, and, frankly, many high officials were not interested in it either, for other reasons. The authorities had their man in custody, and the FBI was already saying it was an open and shut case. Lee Harvey Oswald was the one who fired the fatal shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. All they really needed from the autopsy was to remove the bullets from the president's body and tie them back forensically to the Mannlicher Carcano rifle that was already in custody. There was really no need for anything more to come out of the autopsy. No real great level of sophistication required. That would do it. That would be enough to convict the killer. So the autopsy truly began as an exercise to simply excise the bullet or bullets from the president's body. I know this is a stretch, but maybe you or I could successfully do that. Crudely, anyway. Little did anyone know that all of the other questions surrounding the assassination would bubble up and require, inevitably, that we turn to key forensic evidence in order to try and resolve who really fired the shot that killed the president, and from where. Even in 1963, it was pure naivete that this question around a pristine autopsy could be somehow suppressed. But as the government began to formulate its single bullet theory, the necessity of conforming the autopsy narrative to that theory, well, it became critical and central to the Warren Commission report. Without a cohesive and credible autopsy finding which supported the single bullet theory, the idea of a lone assassin, the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald was the only one up on the floor firing a gun, firing it from the 6th floor of the school book depository? Well, without such a cohesive and credible autopsy report, the whole thing would just fall apart. Government officials found themselves in a difficult circumstance. They may have embraced the lone gunman theory for practical public policy reasons. To settle the country down and to keep the war hawks away at that moment from the idea that the Russians or the Cubans did it, and that we should retaliate immediately with war. A war that, as Johnson described it to Earl Warren, would be a nuclear war that might kill 40 million people in the drop of a hat. It's unlikely that on the night of the autopsy, people like Hoover and others were trying to influence what came out of that process or what was conducted that night. In fact, ironically in some ways, probably the most objective set of discussions about what did happen that night came from two people who clearly did not influence anything there. They were the two FBI agents, Jim Siebert and Francis O'Neill. In fact, in later years, Jim Siebert made comments about the single bullet theory espoused by Arlen Specter, and those comments were essentially that the single bullet theory was nonsense. But the Secret Service on that Saturday morning after the assassination sat in Abraham Zapruder's office and watched the results of the Zapruder film. Sure, no one had done much in the way of scientific analysis yet, and had not compared it yet to the physical limits of cocking and reloading and refiring the Mannlicher Carcano rifle, the rifle that the authorities were now displaying as the murder weapon. That would all come later, so it's highly unlikely that, at that very moment, someone was formulating the idea that it was physically impossible for a fourth shot, given the time sequence and the time stamps contained in the Zapruder film. No one had yet put that two and two together. This sequence of events is critical for you as a member of the jury to understand, in that you have to be mindful of the state of mind and the motivations of anyone at that moment, that night, in the autopsy room. The need to bend the narrative was forming, but it was not yet well formed. By the government, anyway. And certainly not in the specifics of what might need to be done during the autopsy to support a lone gunman theory. Perhaps generally, but not specifically. At least I don't think so. Things did move quick enough, and Lee Harvey Oswald's assassination on Sunday was a game changer. His death meant that there would be no murder trial. His death meant that whatever documentation that was associated with the autopsy, while it might be subject to some form of formal government review, the form of which was not yet at that point known, probably a court of inquiry in Texas, it would not be subjected, though, to a murder trial, and it would not have to stand up to the scrutiny of cross-examination. Truly, by Sunday afternoon, the game had changed. That is why the burning of the first autopsy report on Sunday by Commander Humes got more than just a raised eyebrow as this whole mess unfolded. What might have passed for just the routine disposal of an earlier draft eventually came to be understood as a rewrite of the autopsy report and the destruction of the underlying notes. And Humes, under testimony in later years, probably perjured himself about the destruction of the original autopsy finding, trying to limit the narrative to just the destruction of the notes, and not an original autopsy report as well. And this further added suspicion that the government influence, at least by that Sunday morning, had already begun to leak into the recesses of this story in a big way. And the government now knew. They knew that there was not going to be a murder trial, that the public's own suspicions around what the hell was going on was likely going to mushroom. Obviously, that led to the imminent development of the Warren Commission itself. But believe me, at this moment, there were people already thinking about that autopsy. Even if they weren't thinking about it in a certain way on Friday night, they were thinking that way by Sunday morning. So you see now, whatever they did at the autopsy on Friday night couldn't be reversed. And whatever they didn't do, well, it could stay that way, and it would, forever, because the body would be buried shortly at Arlington Cemetery. The only real follow-up procedure was potentially a resection of the brain that was still to be completed. So, with that backdrop, let's now enumerate the more significant issues within the autopsy. Probably first and foremost, as you have already heard, the majority of Parkland doctors believe that the bullet wound to the president's neck was an entrance wound, the front of his neck. A number of doctors observed it in the short period of time they had the ability to do so. Before Dr. Perry performed a tracheostomy and essentially obliterated the original hole. Their descriptions support the idea that it was a small-sized and round hole about the size of the missile in question with smooth edges, and it essentially had the characteristics and nature of an entrance wound. Now, granted, the Parkland doctors conducted all their work while the president was lying flat on his back. They never knew until after the fact that he had been shot from behind and below the head. This information was simply not available to them to influence their views of it, their view of whether it was an entrance or an exit wound in the front of his neck. There were statements made in the first 24 hours by the Parkland doctors, public statements that supported the idea that the neck wound was an entrance wound. So here you have a circumstance almost from the beginning where a more experienced and highly qualified group of practicing physicians were making statements that would be contrary to the findings contained in the official autopsy. Basic controversy number one. And I will explore some of the details of that later in this series of episodes. And you've already heard some of it in previous episodes, particularly the testimony of Dr. Jones and Dr. McClellan. There is clear evidence that the shot to the back entered the president's back at a point that was lower than where it purportedly exited through the front of his neck. How could a bullet entering the president's back at a downward angle of about 21 degrees suddenly make a vertical turn upward and head the other way, then exiting out of the front of his neck at a point above the height at which it entered his back? That really is magic. Hold on. While it is remotely possible anatomically for the bullet to enter the president's back and then collide with a body part and then ricochet upward, and then exit out of the throat, well, to have done so and not have produced an irregularly shaped exit wound, an irregular shape that would have almost certainly resulted from the yaw and tumble of the bullet after it was knocked off of its original trajectory, well, that is almost impossible. None of the Parkland doctors saw a wound that represented that kind of exit. They saw a smooth-edged wound that was approximately the size of the 6.5 millimeter Carcano cartridge. Nothing that would represent an irregularly shaped exit wound. A wound that would have inevitably have come from that. And remember, in the government's single bullet or magic bullet theory, that bullet was not done traveling when it initially ran through the president. In fact, it was just getting started. It was on its way then to first penetrate Governor Connolly's back. And then it wasn't even done then. There was another curtain encore. It would leave after hitting a rib, and then, as you recall, it would then go shatter his wrist and then ultimately end up in his thigh. As we said in earlier episodes, this is really a stretch. And when you focus on the absolute first reversal of direction within Kennedy that would have had to have taken place with that bullet, it really makes this whole theory seem ridiculous. Unfortunately, the visual evidence of the size of that wound on his neck was there for only a few frantic minutes at Parkland. And people don't take pictures of a patient in the middle of an emergency room event. The only place this information was forever kept was in the minds of a couple of doctors who looked right down at that wound at that moment before the tracheostomy was performed. Then, the physical evidence, the irrefutable physical and forensic evidence, was lost forever. But the autopsy team performed no procedures that would confirm the strange path of this strange bullet. And that is likely because, at this moment, they weren't focused on a single bullet or magic bullet theory. The doctors in Parkland didn't know that there was a missile that hit the president below the head. That was discovered by Dr. Humes during the course of the autopsy. Once discovered, he began a procedure, a rather standard procedure, of probing the path which the missile took. But what happens next would create much of the controversy. As he probed deeper into the wound, there was no bullet to be found. Where was it? The conclusion from his probing is that the bullet did not penetrate very deeply because the path of the bullet just seemed to end. There was no tracing of the path that produced an exit out of the body. I am using lay terms here, but that is normal procedure that would take place, an attempt to trace the entire traverse of the bullet. This led Humes to conclude at that moment that the bullet that hit the president's back had entered and stopped after only a shallow penetration. And then finally, that this same bullet had likely fallen out somewhere along the line. Probably, Humes surmised, somewhere in Parkland after cardiac massage was administered. Interestingly enough, there was a story published a number of years later of an individual who was there that night that did indeed uncover a bullet in the autopsy room. But we'll leave that to a later episode. Dr. Humes claims that as of that very moment, he had not yet heard from any of the Parkland doctors. He was, therefore, unaware that there was a bullet wound in the front of the president's neck. This is a critical and time-sensitive assertion by Dr. Humes. Why? Well, afterward, he would claim ignorance of this fact, ignorance at that moment of the existence of the frontal wound. After all, the tracheostomy incision had obliterated the wound, and this ignorance would provide a convenient justification for the reasons why he did not perform additional autopsy procedures to section the shoulder and try to more precisely determine whether the rigor mortis or other factors had obscured the path of that bullet from its entrance in the rear to its exit, if it indeed did exit. It was a procedure that most assuredly would have confirmed or denied a conclusion as to whether the entrance wound on the back did indeed take a path and exit out the front of the president's neck. The procedure was not done, so we will never know the definitive result. Only the problem here was that there is now ample evidence that Humes in fact was notified of the gunshot wound in the front on Friday night, actually during the course of the autopsy and probably in time to complete such a procedure. His maintenance that he did not know it, well, that now seems to be clearly refuted by more than one highly credible witness, which you will hear from at least one of them in the course of these episodes. It was likely not the only time that Dr. Humes told a lie or committed perjury about critical facts that night related to the autopsy. Why? Well, we really don't know why. Whether it was to protect his own personal reputation or whether it was directed by pressure from elsewhere, we really don't know. But the fact is, he did. The simple notes that Humes prepared and which became his autopsy notes included a drawing, a small outline of a human body, an anatomical pad that is often used in a morgue to make crude notes on. It's not anatomically accurate, but he placed a dot on that outline showing where the bullet entered President Kennedy's back. That dot in the drawing was not high enough on the neck. It was not drawn on a spot that would have been feasible for the bullet to have entered the back and exited the front through the tracheostomy wound on a downward angle. Rather, that dot was placed on the drawing fairly down in the shoulder area, clearly his own drawing depicting the bullet coming in lower in the upper back. This was consistent with the testimony of a number of individuals. And this seemed on the surface to validate that the position of the entrance wound in the back was just too low to have exited out the front and through the tracheostomy wound. Humes would later explain this discrepancy by saying that it was just simply a rough note and that you had to refer specifically to the exact measurements contained on that same sheet in order to determine the exact location and geography of the bullet wound. In fact, this was fairly simple to understand, and it was a snafu. It was one that got so much attention in the press, where that dot was, mainly because it was so easy for the public to understand. Humes agreed to go on television and answer to Walter Cronkite and the CBS News team on their special report that they produced on the Warren Commission. You'll hear that clip later in this set of episodes. What was odd about those measurements was where they were measured from. Making anatomical measurements like Humes was making usually requires the measurement from some anatomical feature that is fixed. The reasons for this, I think, are obvious, right? If you measure the distance from a fixed object, there is little variation that could take place in the measurement. The precision of the measurement then, by definition, goes up. But Humes made the decision to make the measurements from an area which is essentially around and near the upper ear, and then measuring downward from there. Clearly, heads move and they could be positioned left or right or backward or forward or up or down. The point is, they are not fixed. And if a head moves, then using this approach virtually assures that measuring downward from some point on the head could result in the different placements of that wound. Some higher, some lower, depending on the position of the head when measuring. As Cyril Wecht would say later, this just wasn't the normal way you would go about measuring and documenting the exact location of that wound. It was not the normal fixed point that would be used under normal circumstances. Which brings us to the next very controversial aspect of the autopsy. It relates primarily to the experience of the man who did it. Really, the men who did it. This measurement process that I have just described may very well have been the result of a lesser experienced set of pathologists simply doing what they thought was right. But if it was just that and nothing more, it was certainly at least one more indication that this individual, this team that was charged with obtaining forensic evidence on the murder of the President of the United States, was simply not very experienced in what they were doing. That was the best conclusion that could be made, the kindest conclusion without implying anything more nefarious. As I mentioned a minute ago, on Sunday morning, Humes went to his basement and then to his fireplace, and there he burned the original notes for the autopsy. Later, under oath, it would be revealed that not only did he burn his own notes, but it was likely that he burned the first version of the official autopsy report, but not before a copy of it got loose somewhere outside of his basement. We'll talk about that in a later episode. Next, one of the most controversial aspects of the autopsy has to do with photographic evidence. From the start, the Kennedy family did not want photographs of the president's dead body, and my God, they certainly didn't want photographs floating around from the autopsy itself. The Warren Commission had decided that whatever evidence they used, they would make public as part of the publication of the Warren Commission report and all of its published exhibits. In one sense, this was a really good thing that they decided upon. In the subsequent years to come, it was really one of the things that helped to reveal the truth, with so much of it sitting in plain sight. All the evidential contradictions just buried in the 26 volumes of evidence. But with regard to the autopsy, it simply created a very sticky dilemma. Earl Warren got a chance to see the autopsy photographs. He was shocked by them, and that highly influenced the decision to not include any of that material in the Warren Commission report. The Kennedy family was dead set against it as well, and there is more to come on that. In the end, what was decided was that the commission would create a series of drawings for inclusion in the Warren report. And the sad part about that was that the drawings themselves were not even made from the actual photographs that were taken. If you can believe this, they were made based on an oral articulation by the autopsy doctors at Bethesda as to what they saw. And to top it off, these drawings were made from memory several months after the autopsy itself took place. Needless to say, they were highly inaccurate, and because of everything else that resulted related to the autopsy, the whole idea of using these drawings became really a poster child, so to speak, for deception. When those drawings began to come under great scrutiny, and it was clear that they were inaccurate, that ignited a huge movement to attain the actual photographs and radiology materials, to examine them directly. All this foolishness and Keystone Cops routine around just exactly where the rear back wound was located, well, as we have said so many times, a picture, an accurate picture, would have been worth more than 1,000 words here. It would have cleared up all of the controversy. It would have avoided the tens of thousands of hours that were invested in trying to officially describe and then defend exactly where that wound was. A joke, really, rather than just a picture that almost anyone could then precisely identify the location on the president's back where the wound was. That's got to make you suspect. Eventually, some of the pictures would leak out or be released, and that is a story in and of itself. But these pictures would not clear up questions surrounding the exact nature of the head wounds. Information that might be critical in determining the nature and location from where the fatal shot came from. In fact, all they did was stir more controversy. Some of the photographs themselves, in fact, appeared to be doctored. There was absolutely no way that the president's head was intact after the massive head wound that he suffered, yet some of the photographs showed virtually no damage. How could this be? Later, there would be lots of discussion and conjecture about how a photograph could be taken of an area of the head and not reveal the kind of damage that actually occurred. All sorts of conjecture around the repositioning of skin and skin flaps, some of which was probably plausible. But in the end, there were so many eyewitnesses that looked at those photos and said, simply, that is not what I saw. It really calls the photographic information into question. Well, the House Select Committee on Assassinations did do a review and partially focused on the photographic evidence. Work that Michael Baden and his autopsy team focused on did include the photographic evidence related to the autopsy. They looked at the radiographic evidence as well. It may very well be that the HSCA sidestepped many of these more prickly issues, maybe simply because they were so controversial and there really seemed to be no good answer. In some experts' views, they managed to sidestep many of the more difficult and core issues related to the autopsy. Of the esteemed panel that was assembled by the HSCA to review the autopsy material, there was but one dissenting voice. That was Cyril Wecht. We will hear his eloquent testimony to the House Select Committee on Assassinations to better understand why he dissented and what he thought. But you'll have to wait for another episode in the series for that. What they did know at Bethesda that night was that they had to prove, if possible, that the fatal shot to kill the president came from behind, which meant that they had to find some damage to the skull and the brain that indicated there was an entrance wound somewhere on the back side of Kennedy's head. That is really all they needed forensically to seal the deal. Well, as far as the government was concerned. A good portion of the skull on the right side was obliterated from the bullet or bullets that struck Kennedy's head. That night, during the course of the autopsy, 3 additional bone fragments were delivered to the autopsy room. They had been gathered and collected in Dallas and then separately flown to Washington in order for them to be available that night as part of the autopsy. It was not until Humes and team pieced these items together that they were able to conclude that there was evidence of beveling on the backside of those combined pieces. Beveling around the remaining defect or the hole that was formed by placing all the pieces together. That is, the presumed entrance wound or bullet hole. In the world of forensic pathology, folks like to describe the penetration of a bullet and its effects as it passes through a piece of glass. On the exit side of the glass, the pressure from the explosion actually creates a conical impression on the rear side of the glass, creating a telltale sign that such a side is the exit side of the missile. It's easy to see in glass. Well, the same thing happens when a bullet passes through bone. And piecing these skull fragments together allowed Humes to conclude that beveling had occurred on the inside of what was now a semi-complete or near-complete reconstruction of the defect in the president's head. Obtaining the 3 fragments was like completing a puzzle. That evidence led the autopsy team to conclude that the shot had come from higher up, and most importantly, from the rear, consistent with where Lee Harvey Oswald was thought to have made that fateful shot from. Well, those bone fragments came in late Friday night. They were taken directly down to the X-ray department where they were X-rayed by the higher quality fixed X-ray equipment that was in the department itself, rather than the portable X-ray equipment that was in the morgue. Portable X-ray equipment tends to produce a lesser quality film in general than the fixed equipment you would find in a radiology department. So the X-rays of those fragments are arguably a better quality than the rest of the X-rays taken that evening. The initial visual inspection of those interior conical edges did not produce a conclusion that there was any bullet residue from the bullet or any type of metal fragments shown. However, the higher quality X-ray did, to John Ebersol's surprise, produce that. In later years, more highly technical experts would challenge the conclusions that the evidence was sufficient to conclude on that interior beveling, the basic facts that support a shot coming from the rear. But because the basic evidential materials were tucked away for so long after the assassination, there really wasn't anyone who could challenge it. Not in the early years, anyway, after the assassination. Oh, and by the way, not even the Warren Commission staffers, the lawyers themselves, including Arlen Specter, were allowed to see the original photographic evidence and the radiologic evidence. none of that was revealed for their use in preparing the Warren Commission report. Another tragedy of the second degree. Interestingly enough, the Warren Commission report put the entrance of the head wound lower and to the right on the head, and placed an exit location for at least a fragment of the bullet at a position that was more toward the right and front. Later, the HSCA, for a number of reasons, would conclude that the location of the entrance wound, as set forth in the Warren Commission materials, was materially in error. That is, where the bullet was documented to have initially entered the head. The Warren Commission conclusion was actually lower and was, in fact, quite consistent with what Dr. McClellan and other doctors at Parkland expressed when describing the damage to the head. You heard McClellan clearly saying that a portion of the cerebellum was missing, a portion of the brain that resides closer to the lower portion of the skull. So the Warren Commission conclusion, ironically, was more consistent in one scenario with a shot that came in at a lower point of entry. The HSCA, possibly concerned about the downward angle of trajectory, which, as we now know, was somewhere between 20 and 21 degrees, along with other evidence considered, concluded that the shot entered higher up. Wouldn't you know it? Controversy over measurements also came into play in the placement of this entry wound as well. Jeez Louise. There was at least one red herring, in my opinion, related to the autopsy. Even though it was clear that the president had died of a gunshot wound to the head, for some critics it seemed relevant that in a comprehensive autopsy, more should have been done to determine the extent and the progression of the president's bout with Addison's disease and his adrenal gland failure that he was suffering from. Their contention was that as the commander-in-chief of the United States, he had a life-threatening disease, a disease that could have impacted all sorts of scenarios and certainly his overall ability to lead. We know how he led. He was treated with testosterone, among other things, for this affliction, and there is no doubt that that probably had a concerted impact on his sex drive. He knew in some ways that he was living on borrowed time. All of that together, I am sure, created some of the reckless personal and social behavior that are now more prominent in the overall story that is Camelot and the overall story that is JFK. In my mind, this whole topic is irrelevant. He led in an exceptional fashion on almost every historic occasion, perhaps with the exception of the Bay of Pigs, albeit not always to everyone's liking. But it's hard for history to criticize it now. There is more related to the autopsy. Ignoring and not making available the president's closing for use in the exact determination of where the bullet hole likely occurred in his back. Kennedy was perfectly tailored, and that bullet passed through his beautifully tailored suit and shirt before it entered into his body. When the location of those bullet holes were finally revealed through photographs of the suit and the shirt, defenders of the Warren Commission conclusions, those rabid defenders of an entry point that was higher up on the shoulder, closer to the neck, immediately got to work on the idea that Kennedy's well-tailored suit must have been bunched up in the back and that the position of the hole on the suit was not indicative of where the bullet actually entered on his body. I've worn suits in my life since I was 22 years old. Well, tailored suits, even when sitting in a car, and for a man that was as fit as he and wearing a European cut, well, I guess anything could happen, but if you look at the visuals from the Zapruder film and other stills that were taken, his coat does not seem to be riding up at all, and I wouldn't have expected it with the kind of body he had and the suit he was wearing. It just doesn't seem to be the case. I know from my almost 40-year history of wearing suits, and especially a suit cut like his that day, it was just highly unlikely that his suit got bunched up in such a way that it supported a materially different point of entry than what was actually indicated by the hole in the suit itself. But the defenders of the Warren report try they did to make that argument. Oh, and we should not conclude this whole thing without just reiterating the idea that there might have been some form of alteration of the president's body, or some use of other anatomical structures. For instance, the use of a separate brain or head when making x-rays or taking pictures that were not easily identifiable through facial identification. I know that seems incredibly far-fetched, but some of the pictures are as incredibly far-fetched. Some of this was debunked by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, but there was more here than just what they were looking at. There is an interesting side story that is documented in a book called Without Smoking Gun. It's the story of the death of Lieutenant Commander William Pitzer. It has everything to do with real concerns that there was quite a nefarious goings-on related to the photographic evidence. Whether his death, which is documented in this very sensational story, is related to the cover-up or not, whether this is true or not, is conjecture at this point. But the story is very spooky, and this was a man that was very close to it all. We'll get to that in one of the later episodes related to the autopsy. I'll bet you can't wait for all the episodes I have coming, right? How many have I already promised today? Oh, and here's one more thing. The radiology results taken that night show a spray of radio-opaque objects which were embedded across the side of the president's head. Some of them were removed for analysis. The radiologist and the pathologist determined that they were a series of gunshot fragments. What is odd about that, at least to me, is that the ammunition that was supposedly fired from the Mannlicher Carcano rifle was military-style ammunition. That is, it was ammunition encased in a full metal jacket. It's the type of ammunition sanctioned by the Geneva Convention. And this kind of ammunition is not supposed to break up when it hits its target. It's the kind of missile that is supposed to pass right through the recipient and do limited damage because it does not produce shrapnel in the same way that an unjacketed bullet would. I know, I'm oversimplifying a full metal jacket penetration, but I'm just saying. There are some that believe that the bullet that actually hit and killed JFK was a frangible bullet, just the sort that might leave this kind of radiologic trail, and not the splintering of a full metal jacket. You'll hear from a former high-ranking officer at the FBI on that one, someone who, for a long time, was very close to the top. But you will have to wait. That, too, is for another day and another episode in this series on the autopsy. Thank you for listening to episode 65 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 66. Sometimes you just have to eat your own words. In one of the previous autopsy episodes, I had mentioned that I am a stickler for precision language, particularly regarding technical subjects. And yet, almost as quickly as I posted the last 3 episodes on the autopsy, I realized that I had gotten a few facts wrong. That happens here from time to time, and when it does happen, I try to correct it, at least if it's material. I got these matters wrong in my rush to get those episodes out to you as I dashed off on a 10-day trip. And these errors, I realized, were to some extent a result of not using precision language. I'll explain. First, when describing some of the bullet fragments in reference to the X-rays that were taken, I described the existence of radio-opaque materials along the side of President Kennedy's head. After I listened to that description, after that episode went live, I realized it sounded almost as if he had been shot with a shotgun and that I was describing perhaps buckshot that was embedded on the exterior of his head itself. What I was actually describing was the visual from the X-ray that was taken, which showed a path of those fragments inside the president's brain, not outside of his head. So for those of you who caught that, I'm sorry about that. Second, I also indicated that Dr. Humes had made the dot on the anatomical pad showing the spot in the shoulder where the bullet had pierced the president. It was actually Dr. Boswell that made that dot on the pad itself. I also got some of the facts mixed up on what parts of the autopsy documentation exactly were destroyed and when by Dr. Humes. As you know, he revised his autopsy report, and I was speaking to one of the details of that. I've got an episode coming up that focuses on, among other things, Humes. And in that one, I will elaborate on what I now believe to be the best understanding of what actually happened with the documentation. But we'll let that one rest on the floor for now. Oh, and one other thing. I believe I might have said that the only one of the three pathologists that had spoken to the Warren Commission was Dr. Humes, the lead pathologist. That is not true. Actually, Humes, Boswell, and Fink all spoke to the Warren Commission, and they spoke in other investigative venues as well. As I have mentioned before, though, Dr. Fink was the only one of the three good doctors to testify and be cross-examined at an actual trial. And of course, the only trial on the topic was the Clay Shaw trial in New Orleans that was conducted by Jim Garrison. I have to admit, being inside the labyrinth of the medical autopsy creates a disorientation of the facts. At least for me, this is one of the more confusing areas of the assassination. In some ways, first-hand accounts were never allowed to be taken beyond the official documents and sworn testimony because everyone present at the autopsy that night or shortly thereafter was asked to sign an order of secrecy requiring them to say nothing to no one, for a period of 15 years, or face severe criminal charges and fines. It proved to be effective. And it also injected into the circumstance what inevitably happens when testimonials begin to appear some 15 years or more after the actual events, when things are, as we know, less fresh in everyone's mind. There are many recollections in this story about the night of the autopsy that are just plain in contravention with one another. All we can do now is listen to witness testimony or conversations and decide for ourselves what might be the truth. The House Select Committee on Assassinations was not the first investigative body to look into the autopsy material and its credibility as published by the Warren Commission. But interestingly enough, their investigations came at just about the 15-year mark in 1978, just in time for the secrecy restrictions to run out, or in some cases, just before, depending on the exact date of the testimony taken. The HSCA investigation was the first investigation with a chance to run out the clock, so to speak, on those secrecy restrictions. You have to wonder how that figured in, at least to things that were said before time ran out under those secrecy clauses. A glimpse of that is heard in the sworn testimony of 2nd Lieutenant Richard Lipsey. He was a young officer, 24 years of age, who by incredible chance was picked out of a group of more than 200 officers that were up for the position, and who ended up becoming an aide-de-camp to General Philip Wheel. When Wheel was transferred to Washington, Lipsey went with him. You've met General Philip Wheel in one of the previous autopsy episodes. Lipsey was asked to testify before the House Select Committee, and he himself asked the interrogators that question about the secrecy clause, whether it was still applicable and whether he was still under a government restriction despite being called to testify. And based on my math, it still was applicable at the time of his testimony. A 15-year expiration meant that time would have run out in late November 1978. His testimony was taken in January 1978, about 10 months prior to the expiration of the secrecy agreement. Listen to what Lipsey said on that topic. Lipsey turns out to be an interesting character in this act of the play. He was right there. He saw it all. So he says. Yet he was not in the inventory of individuals that were in the original Siebert and O'Neill FBI inventory of attendees. That does cast a bit of a shadow on the FBI report. That makes it difficult to believe that others might not have been there as well, others that were not documented in that Siebert and O'Neill report as being present at the autopsy. As you recall, the Siebert and O'Neill report is widely seen as containing the most comprehensive list of those present at the autopsy itself. On the other hand, maybe the Siebert and O'Neill inventory was accurate, and Lipsey's facts morphed a bit over the years. You'll hear him tell a story in his later years that he was no more than 6 or 8 feet away during most of the autopsy. Basically a front row seat right in the autopsy room. And, he also says that there were very few people in the room. Listen to that in contrast to what was documented in the Siebert and O'Neill report. Interestingly enough, a newspaper story of Lipsey's account does seem to report other facts consistent with the rest of Lipsey's story that he tells today and that you will hear, with the exception of one thing. The newspaper story placed him up in the student gallery watching the autopsy from there. These discrepancies are indicative of so much that is the story of the JFK autopsy. Good men of good character stating what they believe to be facts that are in direct contravention with what other good men say. It's a recurring theme through this medical labyrinth.
Okay, this tape is now beginning. We are interviewing Richard A. Lipsey. The date is January 18th, 1978. The time is approximately 20 of 12. We're in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It's time for the sporting goods store, place of business for Richard Lipsey. Also present, the staff members, Andrew Purdy, Donald A. Purdy, Jr., Mark Flanagan. Mr. Lipsey, you are consenting that you are being taped at this time?
That is correct.
Okay.
Now, let me ask you fellows a question. Before we start, and the only thing that I've questioned about this conversation is that, and I don't even remember, I don't have a copy of it, I can't tell you what it is, but right, as you know, I was the aide to General Wheel. And as such, we were responsible for all the funeral proceedings, arranging it. We did everything from getting the Irish Guard there on time to the whole bit. And I did watch the autopsy, or the majority of it. I wasn't there 100% of the time, but I watched most of it. Afterwards, about a week or so later, I can remember signing a document in our office that came under some kind of Federal Secrets Act, and that we should not discuss any information. Take information and hold my calls. That we should not discuss anything of a secret nature that we felt was a secret nature, particularly anything about the autopsy, for a period of 15 years, I think it was. Now, are you excluded from this?
Well, it's our understanding that this is...
Not that I know, once again, not that I know anything, it makes a hell of a lot of difference. We were just told not to discuss it and I don't remember whether it was 15 years or 20 years, but I definitely remember signing something of that nature.
Well, it's our position that we are pursuing this investigation, pursuant to the mandate of Congress, and that we hope that you will wish to participate and to give us the information in a voluntary manner.
Fine, no question about it. As long as you feel that in your position with Congress, that anything I may have signed would be null and void as far as you're concerned.
Well, we are not in a position to give you legal advice as to what you should or should not do.
Yeah.
It is our position that there will not be any harm coming to you from cooperating with our investigation because of what you tell us. If there is something that's
I don't think. Well, I don't think there is. I think the point of it was obviously until the investigation this time. This was, the investigation hadn't even started. Was it really that we didn't talk to reporters or anything until the investigation on the assassination of Kennedy was complete? I personally feel that's what it was. So with that understanding, that
if at any point you feel that there is a particular item which is a question of national security or something like that, please consult with an attorney.
I will, but there's nothing that I can tell you. I'll tell you that right now. It would have anything to do with national security.
Okay. And just for the record, to clarify what the orders may have been, were these signed? Who gave the orders to sign? Were they orders?
I think it came through our chief of staff in our office. We were, military district of Washington, and came through our chief of staff. Who was a Colonel Holden. He got it from wherever. That's the best I can remember. Mm-hmm. Okay, no problem. Let's go on from there, and I hope I can help you.
I know. If it's not a labyrinth, it's at least a hall of mirrors. So with that, let's listen to the rest of episode 66 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Who were the three men, the three pathologists that performed the forensics that night at Bethesda? I promised I would cover a little bit of the background for each, so here I go, but I am going to keep it brief. Commander James Humes, M.D., who was principally responsible for the autopsy, was a mere 38 years old when the president passed. At 38, I am sure he was not the most experienced pathologist that could do the job, but maybe the most brilliant at that age? Hold that thought for a moment. He obtained a MD degree from Jefferson Medical College in 1948, and he completed his residency in pathology at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in 1956. In 1960, Captain Humes became the chief of anatomic pathology at the Bethesda Naval Hospital. And I say anatomic pathology particularly, and I will explain the nuances of this in a minute. The following year, he became the director of the laboratories at the National Medical Center. In that capacity, he conducted an autopsy of President John F. Kennedy. J. Thornton Boswell was educated at the College of Medicine at The Ohio State University. He joined the United States Navy before taking pathology training at St. Albans Naval Hospital in New York. He was certified by the American Board of Pathology at the National Naval Medical School in 1957. He was later appointed chief of pathology there. Pierre-Antoine Fink studied at the University of Geneva Medical School. After graduating in 1948, he spent 2 years at the Institute of Pathology in Geneva before moving to the United States, where he continued his studies at the University of Tennessee Medical School. In 1955, Fink was drafted into the United States Army. He was sent to Germany, and he became a pathologist at the U.S. Army Hospital in Frankfurt. In 1959, Fink was sent to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington. The following year, he was appointed chief of the Wound Ballistics Pathology branch of the Institute. Of the three pathologists in question, Dr. Fink clearly had the most experience in the task that these three pathologists were about to undertake. For those of us that are not clinicians, I would like to explain some of the subtle differences when trying to decipher the qualifications of these three men. All three of these men were pathologists, Well-trained pathologists, actually, but that wasn't the problem. In the medical profession, when describing doctors, there are two terms that you often hear. That is, of a specialist and a subspecialist. Your main doctor might be an internal medicine doctor, a generalist, but when he hears a heart during one of your routine exams, he might decide to send you to a specialist, say a cardiologist, who checks you out and decides that you need a procedure. Let's say the procedure is an ablation, which is a specialized procedure applied to the heart. One that is to be done by a type of cardiology doctor that does just that, performs ablations. He is said to be a subspecialist. Your main doctor, your internal medicine doctor, who is a general practitioner, well-trained in many things, and likely even inherently understands the nature of the ablation procedure itself, but he or she would never perform it. They do not have the specialized training or qualifications, and, most importantly, the experience to do so. Now, let's apply that concept to the world of pathology. First, what is pathology? Well, simply put, pathology is the study of the causes and the effects of disease or injury. The word pathology also refers to the study of disease in general, incorporating a wide range of biology research fields and medical practices. A physician practicing pathology is called a pathologist. As a field of general inquiry and research, pathology addresses components of disease, the causes, the mechanisms of disease, and development of disease. And these things are known as pathogenesis. It includes the study of the structural alterations of cells and the consequences of changes in those cells. In common medical practice, general pathology is mostly concerned with analyzing known clinical abnormalities, ones that are markers or precursors for both infectious and non-infectious disease. And these activities are conducted by experts in one of the two major specialties within pathology. The first specialty is anatomical pathology, and the second specialty is clinical pathology. I am going to try and make a simple breakdown here. Anatomical pathology is mainly concerned with the examination of organs and tissues. Clinical pathology is focused on the diagnosis of disease through a lab analysis of some sort, involving bodily fluids or tissues. When you think laboratory, think clinical. When your blood is drawn and then reviewed, this is a clinical lab approach. There are many subspecialties here. For example, you've probably heard the terms cytopathology, hematopathology, histopathology. If you study anatomical pathology and get focused on kidneys, well, then you might be a subspecialist in renal pathology. Now that we understand the general definition of pathology and the breakdown of the two specialties and then some of the subspecialties, we can better understand an even more refined subspecialty, one that is known as forensic pathology. Forensic pathologists receive specialized training in determining the cause of death and other legally relevant information from the bodies of persons who died suddenly with no known medical condition, those who die from non-natural causes, as well as those dying as a result of homicide or other criminally suspicious deaths. Forensic pathologists will often testify in courts regarding their findings in cases, or in deaths that are surrounded by dubious circumstances. Forensic pathologists often have special areas of interest, even within their own practice. A good example is gunshot wounds, or deaths due to drugs, or even things like sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. And there are so many others. You get the picture, though. This is a highly specialized subspecialty. So what does that mean for our evaluation? I mean, if you are going to perform the autopsy on the President of the United States who has just been murdered by a gunshot, you better be a well-trained forensic pathologist and a forensic pathologist that specializes in gunshot wounds, right? I mean, this is a really hard one to dispute, I think. Neither Dr. Humes or Dr. Boswell were forensic pathologists. And on top of that, they had even less experience with gunshot wounds, which is the reason that Dr. Pierre Fink was called in to assist them. By the start of the autopsy, Humes knew that he needed help. He called Fink. While Fink never gloved up, never physically laid a hand on the president, he would be the only one of the three with any extensive experience related to ballistic wounds. Little did he know that his testimony and assessments would later become critical in light of the credentials and experience that both Humes and Boswell did not possess. You know, there is no truly detailed blow-by-blow story of the autopsy that night. It started around 8, as we said, and it lasted 3 or 4 hours, with many routine things that go on, too gory to talk about here. And it got done around midnight, and then folks from the Gawler Funeral Home went to work on putting the president back together and doing what funeral homes do to make bodies presentable. Lieutenant Lipsey was there for that. It lasted until the wee hours of the morning, somewhere between 3 and 4 a.m., when they finally finished up with the president's body and then took him for the ride back to the White House, where a private viewing was then had by a small number of intimates led by Jackie Kennedy. In his later years, outside of his HSCA testimony, Lipsey would tell a bit of the story of that night. Here is one such interview he participated in, a TEDx talk conducted at Louisiana State University, where he does just that. And so let's listen to it here.
Richard, I'm so excited to share your experience with our TEDx audience today. So you had actually interacted with President Kennedy on a number of occasions. Is that correct?
I did, Stacy. I was very lucky when General Wheel moved from Fort Polk to Washington. He took me with him as his junior aide. So immediately after getting to Washington, the president and the general and I were introduced to President Kennedy. We actually went to the White House, went into the Oval Office. He allowed me to sit in his rocking chair while he and General Wheel talked. And so that was our first introduction to the president.
And you would provide him briefings?
We did. When we'd go to the White House, generally General Wheel would go to Andrews Air Force Base or the Blair House, wherever the people were from, the kings, queens, head of states, premiers, and he would bring them to the White House. In the meantime, I would go to the White House and take a briefing book to the president. The president was amazing. I could give him a book from 60, 80, 100 pages. He would skim through it, and within a minute or two, he would hand it back to me, and he could just tell me what was almost on any page. He was a speed reader. He had a photographic memory. He was a historian. He looked to the future. The guy was amazing. He had vision, but he was totally absorb any reading material immediately, and he was
incredible.
Just totally brilliant guy.
Now, General Will and you as his aide-de-camp were responsible for state funerals should either a past president or a sitting president die, which meant the minute that the bullets hit President Kennedy, you were in charge. So where were you when you got the news?
We had taken General Wheel to the office in the morning, and we had come back to his house at lunchtime and dropped him off, went to our BOQ, had lunch, came back to his house, and the driver and I were standing outside listening to the radio. And we heard the news, my God, the president's been shot. So I started running to the general's house, and immediately he came out of the back door. We ran into each other. Have you heard the news? He said to me. We jumped in the car, headed out to our office at Fort McNair. Before we left Fort Myer, a red phone rang. Now remember, these are the days, not the days of cell phones, and this is 1963. And so the general picked up the phone, and it was Mrs. Lincoln, President Kennedy's assistant, telling us to come immediately to the White House. Well, we started to the White House, a lot of traffic. We got to the White House in a pretty timely fashion. But by then, it was known that the president was dead. There was chaos in the White House. There was literally nothing we could do. So we headed over to Fort McNair, to our office, where we had a book that thick of plans to start going through the plans for a state funeral.
So what was your role when the body is returned on Air Force One back to the Capitol?
We had been notified about mid-afternoon that the body would be returned to Washington about 6:30 p.m. So about 5 o'clock, we left Fort McNair and went to Andrews Air Force Base. And before we left, General Wheel reached in his drawer, pulled out 2 semi-automatic pistols, a .45, and he strapped one on me. And he said, now, when we get that body off the airplane, don't you leave it until they bury him. And that was my marching orders. So anyhow, we get to Andrews Air Force Base. The body's coming off the airplane, and of course, the Secret Service and the FBI, they're all up there trying to grapple with the coffin to get it off the plane. And finally, they let our honor guard from the 3rd Infantry there at Fort Myer, Arlington Cemetery, they let them get the body, get it off the plane, put it in this squatty little gray Navy ambulance, which we were using for a hearse. And we got the body in there. Jackie got into the hearse and then started going to the Bethesda Naval Hospital.
And so were you in the ambulance or?
No, actually, what we did, we got the body, the casket into the ambulance. We put our car at the head of the procession and then let it start to leave. And General Wheel, myself, and the honor guard from the 3rd Infantry, and also a Marine guard, got on this old Chinook helicopter, the double-rotor helicopter, and we flew ahead of the procession so we would be at the Bethesda Naval Hospital when the body arrived. General Wheel went to the front door to meet Jackie. I went around behind the hospital to the morgue with the honor guard, so we would be there when the coffin got there so we could bring it into the autopsy room.
And so you were there for the entire autopsy?
Yes, I was. The autopsy lasted about 3 hours. We got the body out of the ambulance, brought it in, took the body, and actually it was myself and 2 technicians lifted the body out of the coffin, put it on this cold steel table, took it out of the body bag, and then the first thing that happened was, of course, the Army and Navy photographers came in, took a lot of pictures. Then the X-ray machines came in, took a lot of X-rays. And then when they left, these 2 technicians and myself literally wiped the blood off the body and just laid the body out and prepared it for the autopsy. And I moved off, as the doctors and the others started to come in for the autopsy, which lasted 3 hours.
The movie Jackie portrays the First Lady as bursting into the autopsy room in chaos and lots of individuals running around. Was that the case?
Well, the movie Jackie nor the movie JFK, the Oliver Stone movie, neither one of them were very accurate. Actually, Jackie, when she got to the Bethesda Naval Hospital, as I said, General Wheel met her at the front door. They immediately went upstairs. Jackie was very sophisticated, very attractive lady. She still had on this beautiful pink suit with the blood splattered on it, but she never came down out of the 17th floor. In the meantime, there was not a lot of people in the autopsy room. There were the 3 doctors, a couple of technicians, myself, and every now and then an FBI agent or a Secret Service agent would stick their head in. But no, it was not a three-ring circus like it showed in the movie.
So were you calling home to say, Mom, Dad, you're not going to believe what happened to me today?
Well, actually, Stacy, I was sworn to secrecy. About 3/4 of the way during the autopsy, a person for the State Department came in with a form that said, sign this. And it was a National Secrets Act form that said I couldn't say anything that I saw during the autopsy for 15 years under a penalty of $25,000 or 10 years in jail. So no, I couldn't say anything I saw. But at the end of the autopsy, when General Wheeler and I were going to leave to go change in our dress uniforms, I did grab a payphone, called my parents, said, guess where I am? And they said, we saw you on TV. Where are you now? I said, I'm at the Bethesda Naval Hospital.
But that was all you could say.
That was all I could say.
Now, the autopsy is over, and what happens then with the body?
Okay, as soon as the autopsy was over, General Wheel and myself, we got in our automobile, drove back to, very fast, drove back to our quarters so we could change in our dress uniforms. We sent the driver to the White House. Jackie had called, and they'd carefully laid out this beautiful dark suit, nice silk tie, white shirt, so on and so forth. Picked that up, came back and picked us up. We went back to the hospital. All of that only took about 40 minutes. And then while General Wheel went back upstairs with Jackie to complete planning the funeral. And by the way, she was very focused from the moment she got to that hospital until this moment. It was until we left hours later. She knew exactly what she wanted it to happen during the funeral. But in the meantime, I sat there for another 3.5 hours. We unlocked the doors, let Gawler's funeral home in, and for 3.5 hours, I watched them prepare the president's body. You know, at the end of that, before we dressed him, to see the naked body, a perfectly fit President of the United States, not an ounce of fat on him, to see him lying there on this cold steel table. The man from Gawler's funeral home and another technician that was there and myself, before we dressed him, we just had to take a deep breath and say, my God, you know, I'd never seen a dead man, and here I am looking at a man I know so well, the President of the United States, dead, and I may be the last person to see him. We dressed him, and I helped the Gawler's funeral man lift him and put him in his casket, and close the casket before we started our procession back to the White House.
And there was a mass held at the White House then?
Yes, we put the body back in the ambulance, the coffin, the new coffin. We went back to the White House, and slowly we went into the White House. We took the body, came in. I stood there at the entrance and sort of oversaw things as the coffin came in. Then Jackie followed and came in. Then we went into the East Room. We put the casket on a catafalque, the same type of one that was used by Abraham Lincoln in Abraham Lincoln's funeral 98 years before. And the chandeliers were draped, a very somber scene. It was just myself, Jackie, Bobby, Eunice Shriver, 4 or 5 members of the White House staff. We closed the doors and they had a private mass for Jackie, for the president, for about 15 minutes. Then Jackie asked us all to leave, and she and the priest stayed in the room for about 5-6 minutes, no more than that. And then they came out. And
I think you certainly have the expertise in terms of the firearms, and you actually saw the bullet wounds on the president. There are a lot of conspiracy theories. What's your opinion?
Well, I did. I watched the autopsy from a distance of about maybe 2 or 3 feet further than you or I sitting together on a little riser. So I could see right down on it from about 6 or 8 feet. And I could hear the doctors talking back and forth. And it was no question there were 2 bullets that entered the president from behind. And it came out of a 6, because they retrieved the bullet fragment. And it came from a 6.5 Carcano Italian rifle, the same type of bullets that the shell casings were found on the 6th floor of the school book depository there in Dallas. So the doctors agreed. I could see it. There's no question Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin, and the bullets did come from behind him and the rear. There were no other shots fired that day from the grassy knoll. And you know, there was a lot of imagination, a lot of people that saw and heard echoes, but definitely the shots were fired by Lee Harvey Oswald.
So all these many years later, what has stayed with you, or what are your thoughts about what was lost?
Wow, that's a really good question, Stacy. I guess the fact that, first of all, John Kennedy was such a brilliant man. As I said before, he was a great historian, but he had vision. He looked to the future. He wanted to know what the world was going to be like. He wanted to put a man on the moon. He wanted to tear down the Berlin Wall. He wanted peace in his lifetime. He was interested in what painters and writers and musicians had to, and philosophers. He was interested in what they had to say. I guess it's difficult to put it all together, but this was probably the most brilliant president in our lifetime, certainly in my lifetime, and I think in many generations. I can only imagine what the world would have been like if he would have lived. This truly was the end of Camelot.
Thank you for listening to episode 66 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I pledge you that we shall neither commit nor provoke aggression, that we shall neither flee nor invoke the threat of force, that we shall never negotiate out of fear, and we shall never fear to negotiate. Terror is not a new weapon. Throughout history, it has been used by those who could not prevail either by persuasion or example. But inevitably they fail, either because men are not afraid to die for a life worth living, or because the terrorists themselves came to realize that free men cannot be frightened by threats and that aggression would meet its own response. And it is in the light of that history that every nation today should know, be he friend or foe, that the United States has both the will and the weapons to join free men in standing up to their responsibilities.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
The path we have chosen for the present is full of hazards, as all paths are. But it is the one most consistent with our character and courage as a nation and our commitments around the world. The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him.
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth, peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers
which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control.
Today is November 22nd, 2021. It marks the 58th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The sound and the fury over his assassination is in its twilight. Only the government and its refusal to give way to what they still know about what really happened, only that is between the past and what is now a harmony with past events, no matter how horrible they were. President Lincoln was assassinated a little more than 150 years ago. We are still fascinated by those events. But in Lincoln's case, the pursuit of a conspiracy that reached to the top of the Confederate government formally passed to the ages as a matter of true concern. Still, regardless of who was behind killing Lincoln, you can truly imagine what might have been had Lincoln lived. I think the same is true for John F. Kennedy. Think back to 1964, when the 3 civil rights workers were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi at the beginning of a Confederated onslaught to teach African Americans about their voting rights. And so many other events like it, the march in Selma, Alabama by Martin Luther King. Those events took place almost 100 years after Lincoln pushed, pulled, and cajoled the nation into abolishing slavery and amending our Constitution. Would real change have taken so long had Lincoln's life not been cut short? Or should we just better understand that there would not have been a 1964 at all had he not lived and died for this cause? And that it may have been another 100 years more had it not been for the courage of one man, Lincoln, giving his own life in that moment. We don't know, really, but we do know that the course of history was forever altered. Lincoln, too, knew of the dangers that night as he headed to Ford's Theater. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton himself exhorted Lincoln not to go, and he even pulled the regular guard trying to bully the president into not going. But Kennedy and Lincoln were intelligent men, and they both knew the danger of that moment. Lincoln heading up to the box at Ford's Theater without full and proper guard. Kennedy driving through Dallas in a limousine without a bubble top. He, too, without full and proper guard. They were both going to enjoy the moment, whatever dangers it might bring. And it was not just garden variety danger. This was the ultimate act of assassination, something that, as a president, is always looming. There had been many attempts on Lincoln's life, including one where his top hat was nearly shot off as he rode his carriage through Washington. Weary from 4 years of war within our nation, in a conflict where more American men died in that war than have died in any war, before or since. Maybe, in a sense, it was a fate of relief for him, perhaps feeling relinquished from the weight of the loftiest duties of the land. He had his own sort of melancholy, that would later be studied and written about. How could a man of such greatness achieve so much while carrying the burden of what is now known in the modern world as a mental health issue? He did, and he did it better than just about any other man ever could have. Kennedy had his own pathos. He was sicker than he let on to be, suffering from Addison's disease. Despite these human sufferings they each had, we will always remember these two men and their beautifully iconic portraits taken at the height of their generosity to the country. I remember Lincoln every time I pull out a $5 bill or see the now and even rarer occasional penny. I collected a few coins as a kid and remember the very special 50-cent piece minted for Kennedy, and the one year that it was pure silver. There is no correlation as to relative worth here. Lincoln's contribution was not tenfold of Kennedy's. Kennedy's was not 50-fold of Lincoln's. Their gifts to the nation were both priceless. Both of these men, unless some current generation chooses to rewrite the history of it, will forever be in our own minds as a perfect profile in courage. This podcast has been about the story of the JFK assassination itself. Certainly the assassination story reads and feels like an Agatha Christie novel, or maybe a John Grisham novel, a whodunit wrapped in a more modern intrigue. But it's easy to get lost in that and forget that this story is really about a brilliant man who exhibited a great deal of courage, a man who comes along very rarely in life, and then, by God's will, was put in just the right place to do big things. And that he did. Kennedy did not have to suffer through 4 years of civil war, and he never wrote a letter like Lincoln did to sweet little Mrs. Lydia Parker Bixby, who had just lost 5 of her own sons in the War of the Rebellion. He did, however, skillfully maneuver in such a way as to save the world, at least once, from true peril, including a nuclear showdown. That really did come dangerously close to occurring, and that would have been far more catastrophic than the bloodiest period in the history of the United States, the one that Lincoln faced and resided over. But Kennedy knew war too. He served in the South Pacific. He nearly lost his life there, and he spent the rest of his life living with injuries that, for many others, were completely debilitating. But not for Kennedy. He continued to reach. JFK managed to make it look like it was a natural part of Camelot. And if you had not read a bit of history about him, maybe you would not even have known that those injuries had occurred, especially if you were just watching a film clip or listening to his untethered voice. But when he went to bed at night, doing what all mere mortals do before they hit the hay, he would unstrap a back brace that was necessary to keep the pain from completely debilitating him during the course of the day and for him to be able to walk upright. It was a step ahead of what FDR faced. It certainly was not polio, but it was enough to have to use arm braces from time to time when the back brace was just not enough. In 1957, Kennedy published Profiles in Courage, for which he won a Pulitzer Prize. It's a beautiful book with a foreword by Robert Kennedy, too. In his own words, JFK described this book as a book about the most admirable of human virtues, courage. He would say it was grace under pressure. Ernest Hemingway defined it, and these are the stories and pressures of 8 United States senators and the grace with which they endured them. I have several copies of this book in my library. It's a great book for anyone to read, still. God never entrusted me with anything that big. But then again, only a handful of us on the earth are entrusted with anything that big. But whatever it is that we are engaged in on a personal level, whatever we are entrusted with, it may take just as much courage. JFK knew that this one virtue, courage, is universal in its application. Few people know that JFK was an avid historian, and he wrote these stories about some men that you might recognize, and some that were less recognizable. John Quincy Adams was at the top of the list, and then came Daniel Webster, and then Thomas Hart Benton, and then Sam Houston, and then Edmund G. Ross, and then one that is rather hard to pronounce, Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus Lamar, and then came George Norris, and then finally Robert A. Taft. He would end with lesser comments on other men of courage. I mentioned a moment ago that JFK knew war. In an updated version of Profiles in Courage, his daughter, Caroline Kennedy, tells the story of where JFK truly began his own public service career. It was as a PT boat commander in the South Pacific in World War II. These are her words. While on patrol on the night of August 2nd, 1943, his boat, PT-109 was rammed by a Japanese destroyer, the Amagiri, and it exploded into flames, throwing crew members into the burning water. 2 were killed, and 1 was burned so badly he couldn't swim. Catching a strap of the injured man's life jacket in his teeth, Lieutenant Kennedy towed the wounded sailor to the nearest island, 3 miles away. And for the next 6 days, with little food or water, the men hid, fearing they would be captured by the Japanese. Each evening, Kennedy swam in shark-infested waters to other islands, seeking help until he was spotted by 2 Solomon Islanders, Ironikumana and Byakugas. They picked a coconut up, upon which Kennedy carved a message, which they took to the hideout of a nearby Australian coast watcher. That finally led to their rescue. In the early part of this century, the National Geographic Society, using underwater cameras, discovered the sunken PT-109, and the same expedition members met Ironi, the man who carried the simple message on a coconut that saved JFK's life and changed the course of history for our country and indeed the world. You never know what God has in store for you, at least while you inhabit this green earth. That moment, God was not finished with John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Kennedy, like Lincoln, was followed in office by a fella from the South named Johnson. The first was impeached, and the second barely escaped prosecution for crimes of corruption, or maybe even more. Interestingly enough, there were hearings that would have led to that and that were being conducted in the United States Congress right as the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza. Those shots killed that investigation, too. Neither of the Johnsons had the true gravitas of their predecessor, although the latter Johnson had a sort of greatness in his own right, and he went on to pass landmark legislation that would try to equal the playing field for civil rights and create what was then known as the Great Society. It's hard to go on when these kind of losses occur. They are guttural, and they shake people and they shake nations to the bone. But people and nations do go on. Ours did. Lyndon Johnson would take the reins right around Thanksgiving and would address the nation in a Thanksgiving season broadcast, attempting to make a transition from the old to the new. It was awkward, like an older, distant uncle trying to assuage a child after the death of the father. And in this case, it was an uncle and his brother that never really got along in the first place. It was a Thanksgiving message that simply lacked the heart and the soul that the country had been feeding on under John Kennedy, and it highlighted what had just been lost. It was heartbreaking to the nation. But in the end, all is not lost. The world was given a gift, and as JFK would say, the Lord's work here on this earth is left to us. And so how we go about doing that remains largely dependent on our own personal profile and courage. I've been blessed today and for the past year to bring these episodes to you. And God willing, I'll continue to do that. But for now, God bless you all in this season of Thanksgiving.
My fellow Americans, on yesterday I went before the Congress to speak for the first time as President of the United States. Tonight, on this Thanksgiving, I come before you to ask your help, to ask your strength, to ask your prayers that God may guard this republic and guide my every labor. All of us have lived through 7 days that none of us will ever forget. We are not given the divine wisdom to answer why this has been, but we are given the human duty of determining what is to be. What is to be for America, for the world, for the cause we lead, for all the hopes that live in our hearts. A great leader is dead. A great nation must move on. Yesterday is not ours to recover, but tomorrow is ours to win or to lose. I am resolved that we shall win the tomorrows before us. So I ask you to join me in that resolve, determined that from this midnight of tragedy, we shall move toward a new American greatness. More than any generation before us, we have cause to be thankful, so thankful on this Thanksgiving Day. Our harvests are bountiful. Our factories flourish. Our homes are safe. Our defenses are secure. We live in peace. The goodwill of the world pours out for us. But more than these blessings, we know tonight that our system is strong and secure. A deed that was meant to tear us apart has bound us together. Our system has passed. You have passed a great test. You have shown what John F. Kennedy called upon us to show in his proclamation of this Thanksgiving, that decency of purpose, that steadfastness of resolve, and that strength of will which we inherit from our forefathers. What better conveys what is best for America than this? On Saturday, when these great burdens had been mine only hours, the first two citizens to call upon me and to offer their whole support were Dwight D. Eisenhower and Harry S. Truman. Since last Friday, Americans have turned to the good, to the decent values of our life. These have served us. Yes, these have saved us. The service of our public institution and our public men is the salvation of us all, from the Supreme Court to the states. And how much better would it be, how much more sane it would be, how much more decent and American it would be if all Americans could spend their fortunes and could give their time and spend their energies helping our system and its servants to solve your problems instead of pouring out the venom and the hate that stalemate us in progress. I have served in Washington 32 years. 32 years yesterday. I have seen 5 presidents fill this awesome office. I have known them well, and I have counted them all as friends. President Herbert Hoover, President Franklin Roosevelt, President Harry Truman, President Dwight Eisenhower, and President John Kennedy. In each administration, the greatest burden that the president had to bear had been the burden of his own countrymen's unthinking and unreasoning hate and division. So in these days, the fate of this office is the fate of us all. I would ask all Americans on this day of prayer and reverence to think on these things. Let all who speak and all who teach and all who preach and all who publish and all who broadcast and all who read or listen, let them reflect upon their responsibilities to bind our wounds, to heal our sores, to make our society well and whole for the tasks ahead of us. It is this work that I most want us to do, to banish rancor from our words and malice from our hearts, to close down the poison spring of hatred and intolerance and fanaticism, to perfect our unity, north and south, east and west, to hasten the day when bias of race, religion, and region is no more, and to bring the day when our great energies and decencies and spirit will be free of the burdens that we have borne too long. Our view is outward, our thrust is forward, but we remember in our hearts this brave young man who lies in honored eternal rest across the Potomac. We remember him. We remember his wonderful and courageous widow that we all love. We remember Caroline and John and all the great family who gave the nation this son and brother. And to honor his memory and the future of the works that he started, I have today determined that Station Number 1 of the Atlantic Missile Range and the NASA Launch Operations Center in Florida shall hereafter be known as the John F. Kennedy Space Center. I have also acted today with the understanding and the support of my friend, the Governor of Florida, Farish Brown, to change the name of Cape Canaveral. It shall be known hereafter as Cape Kennedy. On this Thanksgiving Day, as we gather in the warmth of our families, in the mutual love and respect which we have for one another, and as we bow our heads in submission to divine providence, let us also thank God for the years that he gave us inspiration through his servant, John F. Kennedy. Let us today renew our dedication to the ideals that are American. Let us pray for his divine wisdom in banishing from our land any injustice or intolerance or oppression to any of our fellow Americans, whatever their opinion, whatever the color of their skins. For God made all of us, not some of us, in his image. All of us, not just some of us, are his children. And finally, to you as your president, I ask that you remember your country and remember me each day in your prayers. And I pledge to you the best within me to work for a new American greatness, a new day when peace is more secure, when justice is more universal, when freedom is more strong in every home of all mankind. Thank you and good night.
Thank you for listening to episode 67, a special anniversary edition of JFK, The Enduring Secret.